This American government photograph was taken in 1917. It shows a group of dignitaries at a U.S. Army training camp in Washington, D.C. They have come to see the latest tricks in camouflage. At the head of the group is President Woodrow Wilson, who is in the foreground on the left. He is talking to the head of the U.S. Camouflage Corps, a man named Homer St. Gaudens, whose father was the artist Augustus St. Gaudens. Another well-known artist was also present that day. Standing in the center background with a cane and beard and bowler hat is American painter John Singer Sargent. He had been at the White House that morning painting the president's portrait and had been asked to come along. Just as this photo was taken, the president had been told that a soldier was in hiding less than 5 feet from him. You can see his look of disbelief. Seconds later, what looks like a rock in the foreground was moved aside by that soldier, who was hiding in a foxhole. Of course, the rock was not an actual rock, but a stage prop made of papier-mâché, made even more convincing by artful flecks of phony moss. When asked to define camouflage, most of us are likely to say that it happens most effectively when a figure blends in with a background, or in the case of the counterfeit rock, when it seems to fit in with a setting. It is commonly assumed that a figure is visible to the extent that it stands out from its surrounding. Among the most common examples of this are the test patterns for color blindness, in which colored numbers contrast with background dots of differing hues. What is less widely realized is that figure-ground blending, or background matching, is only one kind of camouflage. There are other equally common techniques, most of which are less well known. The 4 that we will focus on are blending, countershading, mimicry, and disruption. In all examples of camouflage, it is essential to keep in mind that the factor of color is foremost. It is vital in all its dimensions, in the appearance of the hue itself, in its degree of light and dark, in its chromatic intensity, and so on. It is also important to know that different species have different sensory systems, and that camouflage only works reliably when it matches the optical properties of the species from which it is trying to hide. A good example of the difference of sensory systems between 2 species is the vision of humans when hunting for deer and the vision of the deer themselves. High visibility orange or safety orange is conspicuous for humans. It is an ideal color with which to protect other people. Deer, like human beings, are susceptible to camouflage made up of the colors of foliage, but they are colorblind to high visibility orange and see it as a muted tone. To demonstrate kinds of camouflage, I would like to introduce my cat. Her name is Saskia. She was named in honor of the wife of Rembrandt, the artist. She has nuanced black, brown, and off-white coloring, marked by tiger-like patterns of stripes arranged in fearful symmetry. She is the kind of cat that's called a tabby. In appropriate settings, Saskia's colors and patterns ensure that she will benefit from figure-ground blending or background matching. But there are countless other animals, insects, and plants that blend in far more perfectly with the surroundings in which they are commonly found. Shown here is not a photograph, but rather an intricate painting of a male ruffed grouse within a wooded surrounding. It was painted in 1909 by American artist and ornithologist Gerald Thayer. It is a small-sized watercolor that was used as an illustration in one of the earliest, most important books on animal camouflage, titled Concealing Coloration in the Animal Kingdom. The younger Thayer was listed as the book's author, but in truth the text was monitored by his father, Abbot Thayer, a well-known artist and naturalist. Gerald Thayer's grouse painting attempts to show persuasively the extent to which an animal's colors and patterns repeat the visual attributes of its surrounding. When startled, an animal's common response is to freeze, to remain perfectly still. As a result, its presence may not be given away, and the desired effect may be, as the Thayers called it, background picturing, of seeing through the animal, if not literally, as if it were transparent. Blending is dependent on high similarity between a figure and its ground. This is further strengthened by the capacity of some animals to change their coloration in relation to seasonal changes. Some animals are tawny-colored during warmer seasons, but as the snow season approaches, their colors gradually turn to white. It is even more astonishing that certain animals have acquired the ability to alter their outward appearance instantaneously as required by changes in circumstance. It is well known that chameleons can change their body color, and flounders can alter their patterns as well. But in recent years, much has been discovered about the phenomenal ability of cuttlefish to radically change their appearance. They can quickly make their color match nearly any surrounding, but they can also radically change their shape, color, texture, and other physical attributes to make them appear to be another, different kind of thing, a variety of camouflage known as mimicry. But let's go back to Saskia, because something was discovered about animal coloration in 1896 that Saskia exemplifies. It is called countershading, but it's also sometimes known as Thayer's law, because the person who described it then was none other than the artist Abbot Thayer. In observing a wide range of animals, Thayer began to wonder why so many of them, and especially those that are active during the day, have coloration that is lighter, sometimes even white, on their undersides, then progressively darker toward the top. Thayer came to realize that this system of coloration is the exact opposite of shading, as commonly practiced by artists. As a result, he called it inverse shading or countershading. He had been trained as an artist in the French Academy, and one of the uses of shading is to make flat surfaces, such as a shape that is drawn on a flat piece of paper, appear to have volume, to appear to be three-dimensional. The effect can be amazing, so much so that a shape may seem to rise above the drawing table or to protrude from the wall where the painting is hung. At the same time, this is hardly new to anyone at this time in history, whether artists or non-artists. Virtually everyone who uses a computer has frequently worked with shading because the most common use of it today is in the creation of drop shadows. Drop shadows are especially convincing when a shape is lighted from the top. There is a compelling example of this in a drawing of a hand by a British artist named Solomon J. Solomon. By his skillful use of top-down lighting and the placement of heavier shading below, Solomon's drawing of a hand appears to have solidity and to emerge from the plane of the surface it's on. It is of curious interest to note that this same Solomon J. Solomon was the head of British Army camouflage in the early days of World War I. It was he who wrote the first book on military camouflage. Drop shadows work, as scientists claim, because certain creatures, including humans, have a built-in tendency to see top-lit forms as bulging out or convex, while shapes lit from the bottom may instead look like depressions. This can be demonstrated by looking at a photograph of the moon when lighted from the top, in which case we can clearly see craters. But when that same photograph is turned upside down, those craters instead appear to be mounds. It was Thayer's belief that when animals are countershaded, it fulfills a certain function. Again, they are colored lightest on their undersides, a surface least affected by overhead light. They are gradually darker toward the top, where the overhead lighting is the strongest. This is the inverse of shading, such that when suitable lighting prevails, the animal would appear to be flat, not volumetric, and, by that, less solid, less thing-like. Thayer's disclosure of countershading in 1896 was largely accepted by scientists, artists, and others. It compelled him to focus increasingly on camouflage, both natural and military. He did not abandon painting, but as he aged, he devoted increased efforts toward making models by which he could prove the function of countershading. Famously, he could make a wooden duck decoy all but invisible simply by countershading it. Or, short of using a duck decoy, he could countershade a sweet potato to make it vanish on the ground. He once countershaded a replica of the Venus de Milo, which he installed for children to view in the town hall of Dublin, New Hampshire. Simply by switching the lighting, he could make that sculpture appear or disappear. He devised a stage lighting system to make an actor disappear by countershading his leotards. He obtained a camouflage patent for countershading a ship, the results of which resembled the coloration of a seagull. Primarily through his writings, Thayer persuaded young artists that camouflage was an area of expertise that could and should be practiced solely by artists, not by scientists who had not been trained to see. His often controversial claims encouraged the participation of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of artists, designers, illustrators, architects, and set designers as camouflage designers, referred to then as camoufleurs. During World War I, at a time when American women were not allowed to vote, nor could they serve in the military, a group of civilian women, some of whom were artists, succeeded in forming a unit called the Women's Reserve Camouflage Corps. In that capacity, they became adept at making camouflage patterns coverall suits, which enabled them to blend with rocks. Of the 4 kinds of camouflage, it seems likely that my cat Saskia benefits least from mimicry. As in background matching, mimicry depends on high similarity. It is not from the likeness of figure and ground, but from the visual resemblance between different kinds of things. While Saskia may not be a good example of mimicry, it occurs to some degree in cats, especially in wild cats, in the sense that some, notably leopards and tigers, have markings on the backs of their ears that, from a distance, are easy to mistake for eyes. It is almost a literal example of a creature with eyes in the back of its head. Even a cursory survey of animals, insects, and plants would strongly suggest that various organisms gain a survival advantage by looking like other quite different things. There are all but countless insects and animals that look amazingly like twigs, dead leaves, grass, tree bark, and flowers. There are birds who deposit their eggs in the nests of other unrelated birds. Their eggs are convincingly similar to the eggs of the host, who raises the intruder's chicks. There are plants that are sometimes mistaken for rocks, and there are non-poisonous creatures that benefit from their resemblance to those that are toxic. Among the most common examples of mimicry are imitation eye-like shapes known as eye spots or ocelli. These are everywhere, most notably in butterflies, moths, and other insects, as well as in fish and turtles. They appear in so many species and in such variety that it's difficult to know if predators view them as vertebrate eyes, which may ward off attackers, or as conspicuous targets, which might divert the attention of predators to the least vital parts of the body. Some of the most striking examples of natural mimicry can only be seen in remote, inaccessible locations, such as in rainforests. What is not often realized is that examples of mimicry are abundant in any location if one knows how to seek them out. In the American Midwest, for example, on our own residential property, my wife and I have observed and photographed such amazing examples of mimicry as the praying mantis, which looks like a blade of grass. We see butterflies, moths, and birds that look remarkably like tree bark, and others that might be mistaken for dead leaves. On our property, one of our favorite mimics is the caterpillar of a swallowtail butterfly that has an amazing resemblance to a moist bird dropping. When disturbed, it sticks out a red, forked, tongue-like shape that emits a pungent odor. With the adoption of camouflage during World War I by all sides of the conflict, attempts at mimicry for military purposes became widely adopted. The earlier rock made of papier-mâché was only one of the many tricks that were introduced during that war. Shown here is a camouflage soldier who appears to be part of a tree stump. Dead trees were also commonly used as disguised observation posts on the battlefields in France. This one, like most, was lined with plates of metal. It was constructed behind the front line, then secretly installed at night. On its backside is an entry door with access to a ladder. Horses were a daily casualty in World War I, so their carcasses were everywhere. Some camoufleurs took advantage of this and made imitation dead horses, which, when hollowed out, could be used as observation posts. Both sides made dummies of soldiers, which were positioned in such a way that they might be fired at by snipers who might then reveal their position. This French soldier on the right is displaying a captured German decoy. Another use of mimicry in World War I was the use of dummy cannons. They were harmless, of course, in the usual way, but they served as a means of provoking enemy forces to waste their ammunition and to reveal their position. The last example of mimicry is an attempt by French soldiers to construct a lightweight but believable cow out of papier-mâché, which, when placed in a pasture where troops are concealed, might convince German aerial observers that it is a harmless, insignificant sight. The last of the four kinds of camouflage is, to some, the most bewildering. It is commonly known as disruption, and the streak-like markings on Saskia are excellent demonstrations of that. On various parts of her surface, but especially on her head, legs, and tail, there are stripes that cut across her form. They are not as conspicuous or pronounced as the vividly contrasting patterns on a tiger, leopard, or other cats, or the strident black and white markings on a zebra, but they effectively break up her tail, while they also suggest that the stripes on her legs are physically continuous. As for the use of disruption in animals, insects, and plants, there is no lack of examples. There is dazzle in nature wherever we look. One of my favorite examples of disruptive camouflage is this poisonous snake, a Gabon viper. It is hard to imagine the dread we would feel if we walked through a forest in Africa and nearly stepped on this bewildering snake. In the early years of World War I, it was thought that the soldiers should be issued continuous one-color outfits. These were often sand-colored and commonly known as khaki, which is the Urdu word for dust. But it was Abbot Thayer who was one of the first opponents of this. Using this image of butterfly forms, Thayer argued that outfits that were uniform would increase the visibility of soldiers, not decrease it, because the overhead light would create obvious shadows that would clarify their features. Pointing to these four butterfly shapes, he urged his audience to step back. As they did so, he noted how the disruptively patterned butterfly at the top center broke up and thus became harder to see as one thing, while the monochrome figures remained clearly visible. Thayer urged that soldiers' uniforms should be disruptively patterned to make shapes and shadows harder to read. Other people argued that disruptively patterned uniforms would attract attention and make the soldiers' locations stand out. Thayer's proposals were so controversial and his manner so combative that he eventually fell out of favor with government advisors and scientists. Beset by fluctuations of mood that he himself described as Abbott's pendulum, in which he swung back and forth between all wellity and sick disgust, he eventually suffered a breakdown, grew suicidal, and then was disabled by strokes and died in 1921. Ironically, while Thayer had only limited success in advising Allied armies, The practice of disruptive camouflage was successfully adopted not at first by armies, but instead by the navies of England, France, and the U.S. But that did not actually happen until 1917, which was also the year that the U.S. declared war against Germany and sided with the Allies. That particular year had been perilous for the Allies, and especially for the British, who greatly depended on overseas shipments. That year, the success of the German Navy in sinking British ships reached an unparalleled level. They effectively used submarines, known as U-boats, to torpedo slower merchant ships, even those of neutral nations, if the vessels were suspected of carrying supplies and arms for the British. In early 1917, German U-boats sank more than 500 merchant ships, and in mid-April alone, 55 British ships were destroyed in 1 week for an average of about 8 ships per day. In March of 1917, a British artist named Norman Wilkinson came up with a counterintuitive plan for reducing the kill rate of U-boats. Until then, Allied ships had been camouflaged in the same manner as khaki uniforms. The ships had been painted a monochrome gray on the assumption that it would make them less visible on the ocean. But Wilkinson disputed that. The goal of ship camouflage, he said, should not be to make a ship invisible. That was simply not possible given the changing conditions at sea. Besides, a ship's presence is easily given away by the smoke from its smokestacks. Instead, the goal of ship camouflage, said Wilkinson, should be to make it hard to hit by a torpedo gunner who is submerged in a U-boat and calculating where to aim while looking through a periscope from a considerable distance. A far better method, according to Wilkinson, was to apply disruptive patterns to vulnerable ships using highly visible abstract shapes. These patterns, painted in contrasting colors, would contradict the vessel's form and make it a challenge to see accurately, much less to calculate its speed, its distance, and direction. Wilkinson's proposal was tested and approved, and he was soon placed in charge of British ship camouflage. He carried this out by devising appropriate camouflage schemes, each of which was painted in suitable colors on a wooden model of a ship. In turn, each model was tested in an observation theater equipped with a periscope and a rotating circular platform marked in increments. If a painted model was effective in deceiving experienced seamen, it was given to an artist who drew up detailed painting plans, much like a blueprint in color, which were then passed on to shipyards, where other artists applied the designs to the actual ships. It was someone in the British Admiralty who decided that disruptively patterned ship camouflage should be known as dazzle camouflage. It was a well-known slang term at the time because there was a popular amusement ride at Coney Island called Razzle Dazzle, and there was also a musical theater show by the same name. The nickname soon went viral with the British and American public, as did the strange, confusing look of dazzle-painted ships, which the public could see in the harbors. Pundits and cartoonists had a heyday. They compared dazzle ship camouflage to the crazy quilts at county fairs, to barber poles, to the diamond designs on a harlequin suit. To encounter a convoy of dazzle-painted ships, they claimed, was like seeing a flock of seagoing Easter eggs, or a Russian toy shop gone mad, or to have the delirium tremens. A few years earlier, the Armory Show, the first exhibition of European modern art, had opened in New York in 1913, just 1 year before the start of the war. When ship camouflage was introduced, the public thought that this bewildering type of camouflage must have originated with modern artists who had been drinking heavily. In newspapers, dazzle-painted ships were called cubist painting on a colossal scale, a futurist bad dream, and a floating art museum. By the end of World War I, dazzle patterns had been applied to more than 4,000 British merchant ships, while 1,256 American ships were dazzle-painted. Was it effective? To a great extent it must have been, but we have no way of knowing, in part because when dazzle was initiated, 2 other preventative measures were also adopted. The practice of traveling in convoys, in which troop ships and merchant ships were escorted while crossing the ocean by armed and faster fighting ships, and by purposely steering the ship in irregular zigzag paths. Whatever the reason, the success of U-boat attacks decreased and the Allies were victorious. To understand camouflage is a boundless undertaking. If it were an iceberg, we have only uncovered the top of the tip. If it were an elephant, we have only grasped the tail. It is such a limitless subject in part because it is related to so many different disciplines, including art, zoology, physiology, psychology, chemistry, optics, the science of color, stage design, illusions, pickpocketing, and sleight of hand. Camouflage practices continue to be developed today, but they are now in tandem with other developments in the extension of human vision, including such technologies as radar, night vision, infrared, heat sensors, and motion detection. It appears that there is no end to the exploration of camouflage, or rather, it seems there is no end in sight.